Hi, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, depending on where you might be here around the world. And welcome to today's webinar, What is Nexus? An Introduction to the Framework for Scaling Scrum. I'd like to thank Patricia Kong for joining us today to talk about Nexus and the Nexus Framework. My name's Eric Nayberg, and I'll be your host today, taking questions and working with Patricia to help keep things moving forward. So if we go to the next slide, Trish. Excuse me, just a little bit about who we are and what we're doing. So Scrum.org is the home of Scrum. We're run by Ken Schwaber, the co-creator of Scrum. And we continue to evolve the thinking in the evolution itself of Scrum, coming out with the new version of the Scrum Guide late last year, working with co-creator Jeff Sutherland, continuing to evolve the thinking, as Trish is going to talk about today, around Nexus and how do you scale Scrum. And continue to help educate and teach people how to apply Scrum in a professional manner. And something you'll hear a lot about today is professionalism and the importance of professionalism while delivering. Our mission is improving the profession of software delivery, and we do that in many of these different ways. If you go to the next slide, Trish. So just a little bit about the series. This is a free, currently monthly webinar, although we're looking at increasing the frequency of these webinars and really focusing in on helping you learn more about how to better apply Scrum. You can ask questions in multiple ways. You can go to, or you can tweet at Scrum.org, #ScrumPulse. And there's other ways we'll get to in a second, but there's also lots of recordings. So you can go out to scrum.org/ScrumPulse and see the list of all of the different recorded webinars that exist today. Next slide. So your microphones are muted. We encourage questions and discussion, however. So as I said, you can either tweet at us or just go into the box on your menu there that says questions, type a question, and we'll take those questions and answer them as time permits. With that, Patricia, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you, Eric. So hi, everyone. My name is Patricia Kong. I am the product owner of Enterprise Solutions at Scrum.org. So what that means is that we are thinking about Scrum and agility in the enterprise and how we can look at the different benefits and challenges that we have in the team level and see how we can explore that at the enterprise level. So I would be remiss if I didn't say Happy Valentine's Day. Happy Valentine's Day, Eric. It's a nice way to start the day off for me, actually. So here today, I'm here to give an introduction to Nexus, to talk about scaling Scrum with the Nexus Framework. But generally, when I start the conversation at conferences or with clients, we always want to talk about first, why are we scaling? Scale has been such a big buzzword, and generally, when we're thinking about it, is it because we need to go faster? Is it because we have a lot of people? And when we talk about scaling, there's so many differences, but what we really think about is that the purpose of scaling is to get more done in a given time frame for us. But then the question really is, what do you want more of when you're scaling output or value? And what should we be thinking about to help us from scaling too early or too fast or unrestrained? And if anything, Scrum.org's message around scaling would be, don't scale if you don't have to. So let's think about some of those things. In terms of output or value, it's not a rhetorical question. We're looking to scale value. So how can we do that? Well, scaling doesn't always mean adding people first. What could we do to optimize good practices? Because when we don't, there is a tremendous cost that we're going to face. Scaling definitely has a cost. So what I have is just a few inputs here from Forrester Research. So last year they wrote a good report. It's called Dealing with Development Team Dysfunction. And in this first one around practices, it says that over 80% of development organizations say that they're adopting Agile, but their adoption of Agile practices lag. So here's some few data points. It actually hasn't changed a lot from what I've seen previously. But it looks here that only 22% of teams are using short iterations. Well, that's how we inspect and adapt in Agile. 21%, this is going to get Eric going, use daily stand-ups. So let's say daily Scrum here, but that's how we as a team would, use that at least one chance to opportunity to come and plan for the day. What about retrospectives? Well, that's for me the most important event in Scrum, 13%, so that we can look and say, hey, how are we working together and what can we do to improve next time? Great practice, 15% are only doing peer programming, and then you have 16% that are using prioritized backlog, and only 5% are thinking about minimum viable product. Well, that makes sense, because if you're not prioritizing your backlog, it's going to become hard to have an MVP. So when we think about value, let's think about what we can do to optimize these good practices, and also how could we reduce the manual processes, because we're talking about how to scale right now. So when we're talking about scaling and how teams, or even just one team work together, how do we consider what must be done to integrate the work? So this is from the same report dealing with development team dysfunction. It says that 33% of managers say that increasing automation is a top priority, which means 67% don't. That's okay, but when we have the question here, how often do you use the following tools when you develop software applications? 25% talk about using continuous integration tools, 11% automated regression testing tools, and 13% service visualization tools. So the question is what can we do to improve these things before we try to push a change, or we try to change teams and allow them to scale when they're not using these types of great engineering practices first? That actually helps scaling. And then the last thing that was really surprising to me was this data that was around developers being disconnected from business priorities and customers. And it was really concerning to me, because in the first graphic we saw that over 80% of teams are saying they're doing Agile. Okay. But the thing is that they're feeling more disconnected and they aren't aware of business objectives, right? So it says here, developers are 6.5 times more likely not to know business priorities compared with managers. And for me, that's how you check out. That's how you get these Scrum zombies that people talk about. That's how you kill the Scrum soul, because we're not figuring out how to preserve and benefit from bottom-up intelligence in the teams. Having development teams being connected to the customers is an opportunity, and it's a way for them to build empathy for their customers or users. So those are just some things that I want to think about, that I think that we could work on in terms of scaling before just thinking about adding people. So contrary to what people might think, I actually don't like hearing the sound of my own voice. I wanted to set off the text here, the context here around Nexus, is by asking you guys a question. So I'm going to ask you to participate in a poll. It looks like Eric already set it up. And it's, do you or your teams currently use Scrum? And it's just a yes or no answer. I'm going to ask you to fill that out. It's pretty simple because it's yes or no. It's not yes or no kind of, or yes or no maybe. So if you could do that, that would really help us get some context for what's coming up. And if you are completely new to Scrum, it's going to be a great learning opportunity, hopefully. And if you're not, you're going to understand why Scrum.org has this very long hashtag when we talk about Nexus of hashtag scaled Scrum is still Scrum.
And,
so Eric, do we have...
The majority of folks have submitted, and there are your results.
So 86% currently using Scrum. Great, thank you. I don't know how to make this go away. Okay, thank you. So knowing that is really good, because that means that this introduction to Nexus is going to be easy, and it's going to seem like common sense for some of you. And when we go through it, it's going to seem like, hey, maybe this sounds like things that we've already been doing, which is what I hear a lot of. And that's because it's normally just an organic progression of Scrum. I was actually just talking to Ken Schwaber, and he'll say, hey, Trish, does anybody say that this doesn't sound new? And I'll say, yeah. And he says, because it's not. It's because it's how, if Scrum was working well, organically these things would have happened. So for the 86% of you and the 14% of you who may or may not actually know Scrum, but are at least not using it, we can talk about how we can scale Scrum without crushing its soul, and that's what we're going to talk about. So here's our graphic of just the Scrum framework. You can see that there's the team in the middle, but I wanted to show actually this representation of it. And this is a drawing, and it's thanks to Mark Noneman and Don McGrail, who are two professional Scrum trainers. And what we see here is the product owner who's in green, Scrum Master who's in blue, the development team that's in red, but the product owner is responsible for the product backlog, maybe doing some refinement with the teams. The development team is pulling work from the red sprint backlog, and the Scrum Master is a servant leader for the Scrum team. And the development team is working to build a done increment, at least by the end of the sprint. So I pulled this up because I wanted to share the story of from our Scaled Professional Scrum workshop, which is where we run teams or run students through a case study. And the case study that we have is actually is called Global Car Rentals, but it's based off of real life Nexus implementations. So in that, what we have is we had a team that was working at Global Car Rentals, and Global Car Rentals is a rental company, and they were they found that their business was slowing because of the car sharing taxi businesses. So they said, you know what, we have cars, we should do this too. So they tried it, they built an app, right? And they used one Scrum to do it, one Scrum team to do it. And they said, you know what, this is working, we need to accelerate. So how do we do that with 3 teams? Well, they aligned themselves and they were working into a rider, driver, and back office team. And the rider are representing people who are taking rides. Drivers are the people who are driving the cars. They can rate each other, so you or I could be a rider or driver, and a back office team to help. And they're working off of that one product to build the mobile app to get an integrated increment at least once a sprint. So they still had one product owner, and they actually had 3 Scrum Masters. One of their Scrum Masters actually quit and went to a competitor, but that was okay. They felt that, you know, they could do with just 2 Scrum Masters. They had started from one Scrum team, and so they had a great aptitude. And so during a sprint, what they wanted to do, one of their goals was to implement something called basic surge, and that's what we talk about in our case study. And the basic surge pricing is when, let's say it's, you know, before work, busy times, before work, maybe after work, at night when you come out from a restaurant or a club or something like that. There's some sort of surge pricing because there's high demand and low supply. So how would we do that so that the riders would pay more, drivers could earn more, and we could record that data? Well, they think about that during Nexus Sprint planning, and they say, hey, you know what, let's get together and see what kind of dependencies we're going to face. And after we're finished with that and we understand, okay, how can we coordinate this? How are we thinking about pulling the dependencies apart for the sprint? Then we can come into our individual teams sprint planning for rider, driver, back office. And from that, we can pull our own individual sprint backlogs. Same. Okay, the thing is that how during a sprint are we going to visualize these dependencies for our whole Nexus, for the 3 teams together? Well, we can do that by forming a Nexus Sprint backlog. Okay, so we're still doing Scrum, so that means that every day at least once, our teams need to come together and still do a daily Scrum. So we're talking about, you know, what is our plan for the day and what impediments are we facing? The thing is to get a global view of what's happening at a Nexus to make sure that there's nothing broken at the Nexus level, to have that global view. What they needed to do was add a Nexus daily Scrum. So they say, you know what, at least let's come together first, have a quick conversation, you know, somebody should go there, the right person should go there, have a quick conversation, and then distill that into our daily Scrum. Let's do that, great. Okay, so toward the end of the Scrum, you're still having the Nexus Sprint Review, where we can all have great knowledge sharing, inspect and adapt, get some clarity, and we're only looking at the one integrated product. We're no longer just looking at the separate things because what we care is, you know, that one gift box. So the teams are still doing sprint retrospectives, but what they found was that they had a lot of common problems or common issues that were Nexus level issues. So for this one, we could say it was they had a really busy product owner because we're starting to scale. They have to talk to different clients, talk to different partners, talk to the organization. And so what really benefits that is to be able to have that Nexus level conversation of a retrospective, say this is what's affecting our Nexus before and after. Because if you come in before, you can say, these are the high-level issues that are affecting us, not only just one team, but systematically all of us. And then we can come into our individual conversations to have that, and then figure out in the last part of the sandwich what actions we can take into the next sprint. So that's really interesting. There is one time when they said, you know what, let's try to do this all together, but they found that they weren't able to address their individual team conversations and retrospective items. So that's why it's split into 3 parts. Now you have that, and one of the things that we know that is a killer for scaling is dependencies and integration issues. So what we have here is we have continuously doing refinement across the sprint, and that's what's helping them pull apart the different dependencies they might face. So here you have different teams just coordinating, and what is something that what I talked about could kill scaling is the notion of dependencies and integration. So there's a couple things that we're going to address here when we talk about how they formed a Nexus integration team. So what happens is that when you're looking at dependency issues, what there needs to be some sort of accountability for that integration for those dependency issues, because you have a product owner who might be coming into 3 teams or might be coming into 9 teams, which is what Nexus addresses. And if there is some sort of issue, who would the product owner talk to? Well, it makes sense that we would have a Nexus integration team where you have people that are representatives from the different teams so that they can have that conversation. There's another thing that we think about in terms of accountability is that it's not only just looking at dependencies, but how do they create sort of this identity that we can have that has representation from the whole. Otherwise, it's just still spread out a bunch of teams or a bunch of people working together. So that's the only new thing that was added to Nexus in terms of a role. And hopefully this, this image of how we just added the minimal things to Scrum makes sense. I want to drill in a little bit more to the Nexus integration team because I know that it can be a little bit confusing. And it was one of the things that we actually updated in the Nexus guide. So the Nexus guide talked about previously, we had said that the Nexus integration team was a Scrum team. And it's something that we actually removed because we found that and the fact that it's called the Nexus integration team caused a lot of confusion. Because the fact is that the Nexus integration team isn't a separate team and it's not doing integration. So what are they actually doing? Well, they're there to provide transparent accountability for Nexus integration, right? But if you can see in that image, it's actually composed of the product owner who remains there, but different people from the different teams to get that representation. Now, besides the product owner role, those other people can change because what they're doing is they're coaching and helping the teams, right? So in terms of accountability, they're looking at integration, but they're also really raising awareness of dependencies. They might be doing things like creating a shared definition of done or facilitating shared architecture infrastructure. But the idea is that we're getting that representation from everyone, and then they are us and we are them. That's actually a quote from a professional Scrum trainer named Rob Mayer that I loved because it's talking about how do we get some sort of representation that maintains and preserves the bottom-up intelligence that we have from the team. So when we talk about the Nexus integration team, it's a virtual team. The composition may change between sprints. They're providing ongoing coaching and consulting to the Nexus. They're constantly highlighting cross-team issues. So that Nexus Sprint Backlog is probably their bread and butter. Looking at cross-team refinement is probably their bread and butter. Some might go as far as to say they're like the Scrum Master to a Scrum team, and I can get behind that to a certain point. And we have to think about that as you're scaling, as the number of Scrum teams increase, the complexity that you have when you're integrating all those increments in a single working increment increases. So this role becomes very vital there when we think about accountability. So that is what we have when we look at the Nexus framework. And hopefully that makes sense. When we, I showed that image of Scrum and how we could add to it, it would make sense that this is actually just scaling Scrum, and everything additional there is just to raise that level of transparency. So another thing that's interesting is, Nexus integration team can be confusing, and even the word Nexus can be confusing. But the reason that we chose that isn't because it's great for marketing. I think Google has a Nexus phone, and Nexus is out there belonging to so many other things. But the reason that we chose the word Nexus is because of the definition that it's a relationship or connection between people or things. And Ken actually will refer to it and say, hey, Nexus is the exoskeleton of scaled Scrum. And we used to have that as a definition in the Nexus guide, and everybody was confused by it. You know, even some of us saying, what does that mean? Well, in essence, what it meant was we have a Scrum team, which is a relationship and a connection, and now we have a Nexus. And what we're looking to do is connect those people, right? To preserve that bottom-up intelligence. And like Edwin Dando says, we're trying to scale Scrum without crushing its soul. The exoskeleton is what we put on top to preserve that goodness, but also to strengthen it. So that's why it's called Nexus. Now, when we get into scaling, what we're thinking about is, hey, we have Scrum. If we build that strong foundation of Scrum, if we think about how we can develop, and our brand is professional Scrum, so how we can understand Scrum, how we think about technical excellence, how we have pride in the Agile values and Scrum values, Agile principles and Scrum values. What else can we do? Well, in the essence of scaling, those are the things that we talk about. Is there's two things to think about. Anticipation, which means, hey, get a strong foundation of Scrum. Hey, lay down something like Nexus. Hey, in a Nexus, use a Nexus daily Scrum. And then there's this other part, which is another funny word called reification. And reification is really the process of making something real, right? Let's make it real. Well, the way you can do that is with different practices. So all those practices that we talked about, great engineering practices, or how you might align your teams, or different ways that you might visualize your work, are practices that can help you scale well or help you just use Scrum well. But it's nothing that we would add onto a framework because there's going to be pros or cons of what you can do. Because we can't understand or know who your customer is or who your user is. We won't know what legacy you're facing. We don't know what architecture is. We don't know what your management is like. You don't know what your politics are that you're facing. So those practices that you put into place will be depending on what you think is right. So I hope that there was an understanding of how we went through Scrum and how it was a minimal addition in terms of what could be added to Scrum to lift the transparency. But I wanted to make some things clear here, is that when we scale, we're scaling for value, not just for output. And I think a good way to think about this is to think about, do you have actually a 50-person problem, a 100-person problem, a 200-person problem, or maybe do you just have a bloated product? And that was something that my colleague Kurt Bittner and I were talking about, which was really interesting. And if you're thinking about scaling Scrum, or if you're thinking about scaling to get more work done, to get more value in the same amount of time, well, the Nexus extends that by creating a network among your teams. It's coordinating those conversations, it's lifting up those transparency, that transparency that's needed. When we're thinking about scaling, we have to be rigorous about removing dependencies and creating an integrated increment at least every sprint. That's what scaling is about. And without first implementing the foundational Scrum concepts, any scaling will be painful and will actually reduce productivity. So we have to think about, and there's a lot of case studies out there, is that can you get ready, and when you're scaling, when does that actually drop down? So those are things that you should be thinking about when you're looking at your scaling implementation. And I'm leaving this for last, but integration, we drill on it, integration, Nexus integration is because it's so important. It's a killer, it can be a killer issue, but it's also an integration of people. So when we talk about that Nexus integration team, think about it that it's an integration of people, and that is something that can help us create an entire identity rather than just a bunch of people or a bunch of teams. This is about us coming together and having an identity and being closer to understand the vision and the goals that we're trying to achieve. So getting started with the Nexus Framework, well, 86% of you said that you know Scrum. So one of those prerequisites is Scrum experience. Those 14%, that doesn't mean you don't have Scrum experience. It might just mean you're not using it. Other things that you might do is know how many teams you have or have some teams identified. Think about that Nexus integration team. The Nexus integration team, the members there besides product owner are usually the people in the teams that are, you know, they're sticking their hand up. They're already doing it. They're already trying to coach the other team members, and they're experts in certain areas. So if you're just starting a Nexus, might that be some excellent Scrum Masters? Maybe. Strong technical people in there? Maybe. There's things to think about. Now, one of the biggest issues when we talk to people about scaling is the idea of product. What is our product? We talked to a customer where they didn't know if their platform was a product or a platform was several products on that. And that's a really normal issue, but it's something to talk about. And it might be normal to have, a Nexus along a platform if you're trying to pull that identity together. Maybe, maybe not. Think about the definition of done at the Nexus level, right? What is it at the product level? What is it at the team level? And get into a sprint cadence that you can agree on. Those prerequisites are actually pretty simple. So we have different case studies where there were teams that were using Scrum, and they understood Scrum, got a very quick lesson in Nexus, and were able to start there. So that's something to think about if you're starting to scale. Now, we have just written a book. I'm a co-author of the Nexus Framework for Scaling Scrum with Kurt Bittner and Dave West. It's something that walks you through a case study, and it also gives you different practices and challenges that that teams may hit when they're scaling. It's funny because Kurt was actually saying how one of our reviewers were getting frustrated that the teams in the book were, hitting and doing all these common mistakes that we see. And we said, well, those are things that we should certainly share in this type of book. But we certainly have white papers and case studies, and we also have Nexus Guide, just like the Scrum Guide. It was recently updated. So like I had said before, one of the updates that we made was around the Nexus integration team, that new role. We wanted to make sure that people understood that this is mostly comprised of people who are on the teams already to lift up that voice. And we also wanted to make sure that we were aligned with the Scrum Guide. So talking about continuous improvement, how would you do that at the retrospective? Or how do you think about that at the retrospective? That's in there. And just in general, lifting up transparency. So talking about the integrated increment, we added, some different definitions around that. We do have workshops, like I mentioned, and we have certifications and assessments. There is a Nexus Open assessment, which is free, which helps you learn about what we're thinking when we're thinking about scaling. But we also have a lot of webinars. So this is a quick introduction to the Nexus framework, and hopefully it's giving you a little bit of idea of where that thinking and how that evolution came about. But I think in a few weeks, Eric, I'm doing a Nexus in action. So what would it look like to actually be going through a Nexus, and what are those details is something that we're going to be doing in an upcoming webinar. But we do have some different ones, some different implementations that you can listen to from the Scrum Pulse. And I'm leaving about 15 minutes for questions. So that's it for me. Patricia.Kong at Scrum.org if you do have questions and they aren't going to have time to come through today. There you go.
Great. So we've got lots of questions, and keep them coming, but we'll start hitting on some of them. I think I've got the first one here from Shibu. When the Scrum framework is followed by everyone according to the Scrum Guide, why do we even need another framework for scaling?
Are they working together and creating something that's done and usable and valuable? So I think if that's working, to Shibu's question, then maybe you don't. If that's working for you, then you don't. And that's why we actually say that don't even consider something like Nexus until you're hitting 3 teams. Because if you have 2 teams, they should be able to talk together. But if you think about the complexity that happens when you're talking about 3 to 9 teams working together, then I believe there's going to be a little bit of things, some different events that you're going to want to toggle just to make sure that you're lifting up the transparency. But if it's working for you and you're able to manage that and measure that, then go for it. Cool.
So here's a question from Sam. I think you kind of answered this, but it'd be great to just make sure that people understand it. So Nexus Guide seems to imply that all product backlog items for all teams should be represented in the Nexus Sprint backlog. Is that really the case?
So all PBIs are in the Nexus Sprint Backlog. Is that what it was?
Yep.
Well, that would be hard. So I would encourage that the Nexus Sprint Backlog really be a visualization of, if you know, however you want it. I would recommend, and I think that we talk about that at least in our class and then, you know, in the guide, that it be a visualization of the dependencies that you will be facing for the sprint rather than everything, because you wouldn't want it to be a representation of all the items from the different sprint backlogs, because that might be a lot. But the main thing that you want to keep in mind is, let's have a visualization of the dependencies that we're going to face during the sprint, because remember, that's something that the Nexus integration team can be looking at.
Great. So again, a question I think may have been answered during the session, but again, always good to reiterate. Do we still need team level retros, or is it only the Nexus retro?
We aren't breaking Scrum, so we should still have a sprint retrospective of what the Scrum team faced. And what that has is that actually what we added around it was a sandwich, what we call a sandwich, because we want to talk about, hey, at the Nexus level retrospective, what was happening at the Nexus? Well, let's take those items back into our teams and talk about, you know, what happened at the team level, but also, you know, those different Nexus level conversations, and then take that into the third part where we can share it back at the Nexus. Now, we do have an example of an organization where they said, you know what, we didn't find value in kind of going off in our own corners. We wanted to do it all in the open. But by doing it all in the open, they still had their individual sprint retrospectives. They just did everything all at once, though. And that was only 3 to 5 teams. Now imagine if it was 9 teams, 8 teams, 7 teams, how different that might be. And that also is going to depend on the level of transparency that you had. So they just did everything all at once. Nexus level, and then they had some individual team items that they could bring up with their Scrum Masters there, so they could address those, and then they would still close it with the Nexus level thing.
Yeah, and so that's great. Thanks, Trish. And I think to add to that, and this kind of impacts the next question as well, as you're thinking about it, your Nexus retrospective is going to look at how are the teams working together and how do we improve how the teams are working together. Now at the Scrum team level, I'm going to have conversations at my Scrum team level that are about how does my Scrum team work better and work better together. And in that case, those are conversations that you may not want to have or even need to have at the global level, but they're really about the individual team. So this kind of leads to the next question, which is there a change in time boxes?
There is no change in time boxes, and the reason that in the Nexus guide we don't actually prescribe time boxes is because it could be very different depending on the level of maturity of the Nexus, but also the size of the Nexus. So for instance, we would just say, hey, generally make sure that you're keeping it aligned with the Scrum time boxes, but there's no change in that. And we don't prescribe any of those things, as you can see in the Nexus guide.
So there's a bunch of questions here around Scrum of Scrums and how is this different than Scrum of Scrums?
So another way to think about that is to think about what is Scrum of Scrums trying to address. Now, the fact that we have something like the Nexus Daily Scrum, where you're coming together, the right people from the different teams, so not always the same people, but the right people are coming in from the different teams to talk about, hey, what are our major issues today as a Nexus? Are there any integration issues? You know, did you break the build? Did anything happen? No? Okay, let's move on. That's what's important at scale, right? Should we have, and we actually have, the Nexus integration team provides that too, right? A global representation of all of the teams in the Nexus. Should there be other things like community practices and all those different great things? Yes. But that's, I think, how we would talk about the Nexus of the Scrum of Scrums, by thinking about, well, what does the Nexus Daily Scrum do to address some of those things that the Scrum of Scrums might have been addressing for you?
Great. Thanks, Trish. Here's a great question about how do you subset teams and so on. If a subset of a full team is attending the Nexus daily, and if
Mm-hmm.
so, how do you ensure the right same info is getting down to the daily Scrum?
I think my question would be, if you need to go to the Nexus Daily Scrum, what's stopping you from going? And so if it's the same subset, that could become a smell. If everybody needs to go, I've actually participated in Nexus Daily Scrum where I saw everybody go, and it was a 5-minute Nexus Daily Scrum. But that would be a question of, how do you share and raising that level of transparency? And if it's not coming through, then I would suggest next time you go to the Nexus Daily Scrum too. And that's the beauty of it. And that's the difference between that and the Scrum of Scrums, actually.
Cool. So I'm going to have you channel your inner Ken Schwaber now. And this question's come up a few times, so I think it's an important one. How do we arrive at 3 to 9 teams?
I don't know if this has anything to do with Ken Schwaber, but it's actually scientific. And we're going to try to make it work. And I think it's something about Dunbar's number. But the 3 to 9 teams is similar to the 3 to 9 teams that you see for the recommendation in the Scrum guide, loose recommendation. And it was something about thinking about those connections. So I've been drilling that Nexus is about connections. And I think it's Dunbar's number, where we're only able to maintain that connection of about 100 people, right? So that's where when you think about that 3 to 9 teams, it makes sense. But it's actually just relational to Scrum. We should ask Ken why there's 3 to 9 teams and explore that. Do you want to express your Ken Schwaber, Eric?
So it is based on a lot of science and how many people can scale. So that's why Scrum is based on 3 to 9, plus or minus 3 people on a Scrum team, and same with Nexus, how many teams can work together. Once you go beyond that, and there's a lot of psychological and sociological research that shows once you go beyond those numbers, scale just actually diminishes instead of growing, because it's just impossible to coordinate and work together and so on. And it's that plus or minus 3, but it's about the right number that we've seen and seen work quite often. So I'm going to keep going here. There's lots of questions. Where's architecture fit into Nexus?
Where does architecture fit into Scrum? So there's definitely something that I would consider in terms of how do you fit that onto a Scrum team, and how you could fit that on if you had multiple teams. Now, one of the things that we talked about is the Nexus integration team, and I'm just giving a potential suggestion, is that the Nexus integration team is a representation of people from the different teams. But let's say that we need someone to be in our conversation. The Nexus integration team might be a way to invite them to have that role. So, could architecture come into that conversation? Could your enterprise architecture join that group? Maybe, yeah. There's no special roles for anybody, though. Jobs for anybody in Scrum or Nexus.
Right, and essentially architecture is developed as part of that sprint, because if we don't know exactly what we're building until we plan it, and we need to start building that out. Just like you design, the best way to implement it to ensure a design is right is you implement it and produce that. That doesn't mean that you don't have architects on your Scrum teams. It doesn't mean that architecture isn't important, but that architecture evolves over time. And if we define an architecture up front and then try to implement it, when things change, things break. I used to build a lot of houses, and there was nothing worse than when somebody would come in and say, oh, can't we just put a window there after the product, right? The house was a product after that product was done. Well, that doesn't take into account weight bearing and all of these other things that now cause a full redesign of the house architecture just to add that one window. Same thing happens quite often in software. So this kind of ties to what you were just talking about, though, Trish. So can the Nexus integration team include other people that aren't on the Scrum teams, like business stakeholders?
Business stakeholders would be interesting, but again, a Nexus integration team is also an opportunity to bring people into the conversation that are helping us think about the work that we need to do to build product, right? Now, is it a place, the other misconception of the Nexus integration team, one I hit on was it's not an integration team in terms of it's not doing the integration work, right? It's a focal point for integration. But the second thing is that it's also not a management team. So this isn't where we would take all, we're doing Agile, but now where do the managers go? They all go in the Nexus integration team. It's not meant for that. So think about what makes sense in terms of who you can invite from externally to bring them into your conversation. And if the stakeholder's there just because they want to be there and understand the status, it might not be the best use of their time or for the purpose of Nexus.
Great. So can you talk a little bit about the difference between Nexus planning and sprint planning?
Sure. So Nexus, I was going to actually flip back, but that would be crazy. The Nexus sprint planning is when we get together, right? So appropriate people, or maybe everybody, that's happened too, and the Nexus gets together and say, hey, what can we do as a Nexus? What makes sense? We need to have those conversations at scale about what work we can pull, what dependencies we might be facing, before we can then go into our individual sprint planning for the individual team. So the only difference is that it's before we do our individual team planning, and it's the main purpose of it is to look at, what else we can do to pull apart the work for the sprint in terms of dependencies. And a big help for that is going to be in refinement. So refinement isn't prescribed in Scrum, but it is mandatory in Nexus, and that should be done continuously throughout the sprint to see what kind of upcoming work we're facing and what dependencies we have, so that we can start to address those up front a little bit earlier.
Great. So do your sprints have to be at the same cadence?
So I would highly advise that if you are multiple teams working together, that you try to get on the same cadence. If you cannot, one of the suggestions that you might think about, and this may work or may not work, is just getting on at least the same comment cadence. So that means if you're in, let's say you're running 4-week sprints, then another team, if they want to run a shorter sprint, they can go to 2-week sprints. But it could never be, let's say, 2 and 3, because you would never meet. And then you would just have to figure out if that makes sense for you. It's really great because a lot of these questions are challenges that we actually put into the course and also the book that we have, the new book that Kurt, Dave, and I wrote.
So there's a lot of questions, so I'm going to address this. There's been a lot of questions around product owner, and I can take this if or part of it if you want, Trish, as well. But how many product owners do I have per Nexus is kind of the gist of the many questions that have come out.
Mm-hmm. So when we were going through the story where I just showed the evolution of Scrum to Nexus, when you have one team working together, right, they're building one product, there's one product backlog. When you have multiple teams working together, they're still working on one product. So they still have one product backlog, which is still ordered by one product owner. And I think the question here becomes, hey, that's really hard. How do we manage that when we have multiple teams? Well, the thing is that I know when we're working on a product, when we pull the rope, we get to that product owner. We know who owns the product. But the thing is that one of the things that might help is if we have a distribution or what we say is the services of product owner in the different teams. So there's still one product owner in Nexus because we're still using Scrum, so we're talking about one product. But do we acknowledge that, there's several teams that might need, that the product owner might need to delegate some work to? Yes. And I think the example or the thing that we say is there's one Santa and many elves, which is a great way, I think, to think about it. Is there something you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I think at the end of the day, the product owner is ultimately responsible for the product and the product backlog. And they doesn't mean that they do all of the work. And I think this is a common misnomer or myth that the product owner then has to do all of the work. No, they rely on their stakeholders. They rely on business analysts. They rely on product managers and so on to do a lot of that work. But they're the ones that are ultimately responsible. They are the ones that are interfacing along with all of these other folks. But you need somebody who is accountable for the product and is accountable and empowered to make decisions around the product as well. And if you have multiple product owners, you run into now product by committee. And that's been proven over and over again that product by committee or democracy doesn't work. Now we have lots of opinions. So you need one ultimate product owner. That doesn't mean that they're not getting input from stakeholders. They're not getting feedback from product managers and so on. But and now if you have multiple products within the Nexus, maybe now that's an opportunity to break out into multiple Nexuses or a Nexus Plus rather than having one.
Yep. So there's a good question there sometimes to think about when we face these conversations was, are you actually the product owner, or is there some sort of, are you actually the product owner? Is there some sort of other title that you should have that would make you feel more comfortable? But the other questions really are, what is the actual product there? Are you working on multiple products? So actually maybe you don't need to be one Nexus. Maybe you're just actually one Scrum team. And then the other thing that you were saying that it made me think about was there's an opportunity, like I said before, when we're thinking about having the development team being very close to stakeholders and customers, right? And that's how we can inspect and adapt and experiment quickly. And when we have this conversation of, I'm the product owner, there's this many product owners, what we lose is that opportunity because we saw that where the development team was getting further and further from understanding what the vision and what different goals were. And I think that's something that happens when you have multiple product owners up in the ear, product owners.
So this kind of gets to Nexus Plus. Do we have a Nexus of Nexuses?
A Nexus of Nexuses? So we talk about a model called Nexus Plus. And everything that starts from, what you understand about Scrum, what you understand about Nexus, how you would start a Nexus, how you would manage a Nexus in terms of, how do we make sure that everything's going well, applies. And then you get to that large scale of Nexus Plus. And when we say that a Nexus Plus, what you're really going to need to think about is integration. So a Nexus of Nexuses, I don't know what that really means, but, is there just a dedicated Nexus integration team? Maybe. Do you have one Nexus, depending on your scale, that's just focused on integration? Maybe, but to understand that there is no special recipe or framework that we can give. It's just a copy-paste and think about those same things that might work for you. And there's definitely some different practices that you should think about. Architecture is much more important at that level of scale.
Do we need to have an individual team sprint goal, or is there just one big Nexus goal?
It would be both, right? So in the same way for definition of done. So there is the Nexus goal. That would be everybody, all the teams are working towards that goal. And Capital One actually did a webinar on their implementation of Nexus, and that was really important to their success. And the implementations that I've heard about from them or from some different other companies is that the idea of having a Nexus goal and the idea of, all of us working together in a Nexus really increased the satisfaction among the teams. Team satisfaction definitely went up. And what you see with the correlation for that is that there was a correlation when they did metrics between employee satisfaction and customer satisfaction. And those start with things like understanding what we're working toward together as a Nexus so that we're not just a cog on the wheel. We're all working, whether I'm on team A and you're on team B, we are all working on the same thing. Now, that doesn't mean that we don't have our individual team goals or individual team definition of done. I'm just going to flick to the next slide.
Okay.
There's a lot of great questions, and I think that these questions might actually be in our different forums and blogs.
They are. There's a lot of information out there. We have a lot of white papers, a lot of case studies, more coming, excuse me, and more webinars coming as well. So I think a lot of these we've answered as part of other questions. I think so. One that's come up a lot is just how does this compare to other scaling frameworks or scaling methodologies?
So I am not an expert in other scaling frameworks or methodologies, but what I can say, and hopefully you get a sense from it here, is that sometimes when we're talking about scaling frameworks, we're labeling everything to be the same. And I have a very strong feeling that Nexus, compared to other frameworks, are apples and oranges. And this is why. Is because Nexus is just about scaling Scrum. If you want to get multiple teams working together, how would you do that? It's not talking about transformation. It's not talking about anything bigger than that. I said, I don't understand your portfolio management. I can't address your politics. There's no prescription for that. Are there some suggestions that we can make? Yes. And the other thing that is really important to understand about Nexus is that if you have been doing Scrum or you have some experience with Scrum, then you can start doing Nexus quite easily because you're able to reinvest that knowledge that you already have. So there's no big upfront, we need to do this before we can start doing Nexus. It's, hey, we understand Scrum, we're going to add some more people, we're going to add some more practices. Let's find a way to coordinate that together, and that can be in a Nexus.
So next question is near and dear to your heart, Trish. How do you measure value?
I paid somebody to put that in. So how do you measure value? Well, it's certainly not by measuring velocity. But what we're working on at Scrum.org and have been working on for a while, but now that Nexus is released, we're revisiting it, is something called evidence-based management. So evidence-based management is looking at different areas of a product, and there's different areas called like current value, the current value of your organization or product, time to market, ability to innovate, and we're looking at something called unrealized value, which is market opportunity. Those are different things that you want to look at when you're saying, hey, are we getting any value out of X? Maybe that's our Agile initiative, our scaling initiative. If we're talking about how do we measure value from a Nexus point of view, those are definitely some metrics that I would want to know before I start to scale massively or I scale and measure again. So there's different things like that, and that is actually something that is very relevant when we say, hey, when we scale, are we just scaling it for output or for value? So if there's more there, that's coming up in terms of what we're going to be putting out from Scrum.org. There's a guide, the EBM guide, that's already online on the Scrum.org website, so you can read more there.
So I guess this is a two-part question. I'll just ask the first part and then we can go to the second part. Refinement's not an event in Scrum. Why did you add it to Nexus?
So refinement is a really good practice at the Scrum level, and at Nexus it's added because what we talked about was that the biggest killers of scaling are integration issues and dependencies. And the best way that you can do that is to think about how we can continuously refine. So that's an added event. And it's really to address that dependency issue.
Great. Well, I think that's about all the time we have. I want to thank everybody today for all the questions. There's a whole bunch more. We'll look at these and try to address them individually with you as well. We could go on all day, but to keep to our time box, by the way, a time box can be as short as you want, just no longer. Something that, crazy enough, this question comes up all of the time. Do I have to use the whole time box? The answer is no. So anyway, let's cut this off now so we do keep within that time box. I want to say thank you to Patricia. want to say thank you to the hundreds of folks who have been asking very, very good questions. And with that, thank you very much and have a good rest of your day.